What if the greatest threat to the church today is not persecution, not secularism, not moral collapse outside its walls, but something far more subtle, far more comfortable, and far more dangerous, hiding in plain sight? What if the words you hear every Sunday are carefully polished, emotionally soothing, and spiritually reassuring, yet quietly disconnected from the voice they claim to represent? Ask yourself this, slowly and honestly. When was the last time following Christ truly cost you something real, your comfort, your certainty, your social safety? Or has faith become something that fits too well into modern life, something that asks for agreement but never obedience, admiration but never surrender? Bonhoeffer warned that the most lethal deceptions never announce themselves as lies. They wear familiar language, they borrow sacred symbols, they sound like truth while slowly hollowing it out from the inside. And the most unsettling question of all is not whether deception exists, but whether you have already learned to live with it without noticing when it began. This is not a message about false teachers somewhere else in some distant place. This is about something closer, something woven into sermons, worship, and smiles, something so normalized that challenging it feels almost offensive. And yet, once you see it, you will never hear the same words the same way again. There is a kind of Christianity that demands nothing and promises everything, that speaks endlessly of grace while carefully avoiding the weight of truth, that offers comfort without confession and hope without transformation. Bonhoeffer called it out long before it became fashionable, long before it was amplified by stages, screens, and applause. He understood that when faith becomes easy, it does not become accessible, it becomes empty. When belief asks only for assent and never for action, it slowly trains the soul to confuse familiarity with faithfulness. This deception does not attack Christ directly. It praises him. It quotes him. It builds institutions in his name. But it quietly removes the cross from the center and replaces it with something far more appealing: safety, success, and spiritual reassurance without risk. The danger is not that people stop believing, but that they believe in a version of Christianity that never confronts them, never disrupts them, never calls them to die to themselves. Bonhoeffer saw that this kind of faith produces followers who feel secure but are spiritually asleep, convinced they are standing firm, while slowly drifting away from the very path they think they are walking. And the more widespread this illusion becomes, the harder it is to question it without feeling like a traitor to the very thing you are trying to protect. Here is the uncomfortable truth Bonhoeffer exposed, a truth that still echoes with unsettling clarity today. Deception thrives best where it is least expected and survives longest where it is most defended. When the church confuses popularity with faithfulness, relevance with obedience, and emotional warmth with spiritual depth, it unknowingly participates in its own erosion. This is not a warning meant to inspire fear. It is meant to awaken discernment. Because once deception becomes ordinary, truth begins to sound extreme. Once compromise feels normal, conviction feels dangerous. And once the church learns to avoid costly questions, it begins to lose the courage to hear honest answers. Bonhoeffer did not expose this pattern to condemn, but to call believers back, to a faith that costs something, to a discipleship that wounds pride before it heals the soul, to a Christianity that cannot survive without truth at its core. The question that now lingers is not whether this deception exists, but whether you are willing to look at it without turning away. Because the moment you recognize it, you are no longer dealing with theory. You are standing at a crossroads. And what comes next depends entirely on whether you are ready to see what has been there all along. There is a quiet fracture that begins long before anyone dares to name it, a subtle internal shift where faith slowly stops being a confrontation and starts becoming an arrangement. It does not arrive with rebellion or denial. It arrives with familiarity, with repetition, with language that feels warm, reasonable, and safe. Bonhoeffer understood this fracture not as a collapse of belief, but as a slow erosion of courage. He saw how easily the church learns to preserve itself by softening the demands of truth, by translating obedience into explanations that calm the conscience instead of awakening it. And in that process, something essential is lost. Faith no longer presses against the soul, it settles into it. It becomes something you carry rather than something that carries you. You still recognize the words, the rituals, the atmosphere, but you no longer remember when they last unsettled you. The danger is not confusion, but clarity without cost. A clarity that answers every question while asking nothing in return. Somewhere deep inside, the conscience begins to sense it. A calm that feels too light, a peace that does not wound pride, a spirituality that fits too perfectly into a life built around comfort and control. Bonhoeffer warned that when faith becomes manageable, it becomes malleable. It bends quietly to protect what the human heart fears losing most: stability, acceptance, belonging. This bending rarely feels like compromise in the moment. It feels like wisdom, like balance, like maturity. Difficult teachings are reframed to sound more reasonable. Sharp truths are delayed, softened, or left unexplored. Silence replaces tension where truth would demand a response. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the cross is moved from the center to the margins, still visible, still respected, but no longer decisive. What remains is a version of Christianity that fits neatly into modern life, that affirms identity without challenging direction, that comforts the soul without confronting it. The heart adapts to this version quickly because it costs nothing to maintain. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet dissonance grows. Words are spoken that no longer pierce. Prayers are offered that no longer tremble. The soul senses that something is missing, but struggles to name it, because everything still looks right from the outside. This is where the deception becomes most powerful, not by denying truth, but by domesticating it. Bonhoeffer saw that the most dangerous lies are those that sound almost identical to truth, differing only in what they carefully omit. They speak of grace without discipleship, belief without obedience, forgiveness without transformation. And because nothing is explicitly rejected, nothing appears wrong. The church continues to gather, to sing, to speak, to function. But inwardly, faith begins to lose its gravity. It no longer pulls the believer toward change. It reassures them that change is unnecessary. This reassurance feels merciful, even loving, yet it leaves the soul untouched, unchanged, asleep. Bonhoeffer understood that awakening rarely feels comforting at first. It feels disorienting, like realizing you have been resting in a place that slowly numbed you. And the question that now begins to echo is not whether faith is still present, but whether it is still alive. As this quiet awareness deepens, another tension begins to rise, one that Bonhoeffer recognized as far more corrosive than open rejection of faith. It is the tension between truth and belonging, between obedience and acceptance, between standing firm and remaining comfortably inside the circle. The human soul craves inclusion with an intensity it rarely admits, and Bonhoeffer understood how easily this craving reshapes belief from within. Faith slowly stops functioning as a moral summons and begins to operate as a social agreement. It no longer asks who you are becoming in secret, but whether you still fit in public. Conviction starts to feel excessive, clarity begins to feel divisive, and silence is quietly rewarded as wisdom. Over time, you learn the emotional economy of your environment, which truths earn approval, which questions generate discomfort, which words are safer left unspoken. None of this happens violently. It happens gradually, through tone, through reaction, through absence. And the conscience adapts. It begins to associate peace with agreement and unity with avoidance. Yet beneath that surface calm, a low, persistent pressure builds, a sense that something essential is being restrained, that faith is being negotiated rather than lived. The soul feels this contradiction long before it finds language for it, carrying an unease that does not go away, only grows quieter. Bonhoeffer saw that this is where faith becomes entangled with self-preservation, where the church begins to confuse survival with faithfulness. In its effort to remain relevant, accepted, and stable, it slowly recalibrates its message, not by rejecting truth, but by reorganizing it. Teachings that demand sacrifice are reframed as symbolic. Calls to repentance are softened into encouragement. Obedience is translated into intention. The cross remains present, but its weight is redistributed until it no longer presses on daily life. This process feels compassionate, even necessary. It is justified as pastoral sensitivity, cultural awareness, strategic wisdom, yet its effect is cumulative and profound. Faith loses its ability to confront the ego. It stops interrupting patterns of comfort and control. The believer becomes spiritually active but inwardly unchanged, surrounded by language about transformation while remaining safely untouched by it. Bonhoeffer warned that when faith no longer threatens who you are, it cannot shape who you become. What emerges is not disbelief, but a carefully managed belief, one that reassures without demanding, that comforts without correcting. And the soul, though outwardly affirmed, begins to feel strangely hollow, sustained by words that no longer carry weight. This is where the inner conflict sharpens, where the illusion of peace begins to crack. The heart starts to sense that what has been offered as harmony is actually avoidance, that what feels like stability is slowly becoming stagnation. Bonhoeffer believed this moment is decisive because it exposes whether faith will remain an identity or become a response. The discomfort that surfaces here is not a flaw, it is a signal. It is the pressure of truth pressing against layers of accommodation built over time. Quiet questions begin to echo, refusing to disappear. What have you learned not to question? Where have you chosen silence over integrity? Which teachings feel dangerous to take seriously because they might cost you something real? These questions do not shout. They linger. They surface in moments of stillness when certainty feels thinner and distractions lose their grip. Bonhoeffer trusted this tension because he knew it marks the beginning of discernment. It is the moment faith stops functioning as inheritance and starts demanding alignment. And once this awareness takes root, neutrality dissolves. You either move deeper into the tension, or you retreat back into the safety of what no longer asks anything of you. There comes a point in this inner journey when avoidance is no longer possible, when the soul realizes that remaining where it is carries its own cost. Bonhoeffer understood this moment with painful clarity because it marks the collapse of illusion. Faith can no longer be reduced to inherited language or communal rhythm. It demands a personal reckoning. What once felt neutral now feels dishonest. What once felt safe now feels hollow. The believer becomes aware that silence itself has begun to speak, that every unasked question and every softened truth has quietly shaped the inner life. This realization does not arrive with clarity or confidence. It arrives with weight, with a sense of exposure, with the uncomfortable awareness that faith was never meant to protect the self, but to transform it. Bonhoeffer believed this was the moment when discipleship either begins or is indefinitely postponed. The heart recognizes that it has been negotiating with truth, deciding which parts to carry and which to leave behind. And in that recognition, a quiet grief emerges, not for what has been lost externally, but for what has been avoided internally. The soul mourns the depth it sensed was possible but never fully entered, the cost it intuited but never paid, the obedience it admired in theory but resisted in practice. Bonhoeffer's life stands as a silent mirror at this stage, not as an unreachable ideal, but as a disturbing reminder of coherence. He did not separate belief from action, conviction from consequence, faith from responsibility. His theology was not designed to be admired. It was forged to be lived, even when living it meant isolation, misunderstanding, and loss. This is where the contrast becomes unbearable for the comfortable believer, not because the situations are comparable, but because the posture is. Bonhoeffer refused to reshape truth to fit circumstance. He allowed truth to reshape him. And this refusal exposes a painful question that lingers beneath all others. What would it mean for your faith to stop protecting you from discomfort? What would it require for belief to interrupt your habits, your loyalties, your silence? These questions do not demand dramatic gestures. They demand honesty. They ask whether faith functions as decoration or direction, whether it reinforces identity or dismantles it. Bonhoeffer believed that obedience begins precisely where explanation ends, where the soul stops defending itself and begins responding. And that response, though quiet, initiates a reordering far more disruptive than any external crisis. As this reordering unfolds, fear and relief begin to coexist. Fear, because illusion once provided a sense of control. Relief, because truth restores coherence to an inner life stretched thin by contradiction. Bonhoeffer knew that integrity always feels risky at first, because it removes the protective layers built around the ego. Faith regains its weight here. It begins to press inward, demanding alignment between confession and conduct, between what is said publicly and what is lived privately. This alignment is costly, not because it requires heroism, but because it requires surrender. The safety of abstraction dissolves, the comfort of partial obedience loses its appeal, and the believer senses that something irreversible has begun. The old version of faith no longer satisfies. The new one has not yet fully formed. This in-between space feels fragile, uncertain, exposed. Yet Bonhoeffer trusted this space more than false certainty, because it is here that truth works most deeply. The deception loses its power not through confrontation alone, but through clarity. Once seen, it cannot be unseen. And the soul understands, perhaps for the first time, that faith was never meant to be easy to carry, but strong enough to carry the weight of truth. There is a silence that follows truth when it has finally been seen, not the silence of confusion, but the stillness that comes after recognition. It is the moment when the noise of explanations fades and something deeper begins to speak. Bonhoeffer believed that this was the sacred space where faith stops being inherited language and becomes lived awareness. Nothing dramatic happens here. No answers rush in to replace the questions. Instead, there is a quiet rearranging of the inner world, as if the soul has shifted slightly out of alignment with the illusions it once relied on. What once felt normal now feels fragile. What once felt harmless now carries weight. You begin to sense that faith was never meant to make life easier, but clearer, that its purpose was not to remove tension, but to give meaning to it. And in this clarity, something irreversible occurs. You cannot return to the comfort of not knowing. The symbols you have encountered, the tensions you have felt, the questions that now linger do not fade when the words stop. They remain, like an echo in a cathedral after the final note has been played, shaping how you hear everything that follows. Bonhoeffer understood that transformation rarely announces itself. It unfolds quietly, through perception rather than proclamation. The deception loses its grip not because it has been attacked, but because it has been illuminated, and light does not argue, it reveals. What you now carry is not certainty, but discernment. Not fear, but responsibility. Faith begins to feel heavier, yet more honest, less performative, yet more alive. You may find that you no longer listen the same way, no longer accept familiar words without reflection, no longer confuse comfort with truth. This is not restlessness. It is awakening. It is the soul remembering that it was meant for depth, not ease. Bonhoeffer believed that when faith reaches this point, it becomes dangerous again. Not to others, but to false peace, to moral sleep, to spiritual inertia. And perhaps that is the quiet invitation hidden beneath everything you have felt here, not to become louder, but truer, not to feel superior but responsible, not to escape the cost of truth, but to finally accept it. And so the journey does not end here. It settles into you, like a seed that does not demand immediate attention, yet refuses to remain dormant. The question now is not what you think, but what you will allow to change. Faith does not ask for admiration. It asks for presence, for honesty, for courage that grows in silence long before it ever appears in action. If something in you has stirred, if a question has followed you instead of fading, do not dismiss it. Stay with it. Let it work. And if this space has given language to something you have long felt but never named, then you are already part of something larger than a single video. If this resonated, let it be known, not as approval, but as recognition. Share it with someone who senses the same quiet tension. Leave a thought, a reflection, a question in the comments, not to conclude the conversation, but to continue it. And if you choose to stay, to subscribe, to return, let it be for one reason only, because you are no longer interested in a faith that costs nothing, and you are ready to walk with those who are learning to see what was always hiding in plain sight.